The court is now in session. For today's proceeding, the Chamber would like once again to give the floor to the prosecution to continue concluding their closing statement in case 002/01. And before I hand the floor to the prosecution, Ms. Sakolboti, could you report the attendance of the parties and individuals to today's proceeding? Sakolboti, Mr. President, for today's proceeding, all parties to this case are present. It should be noted that Nunchi is present in the holding cell downstairs, pursuant to the decision of the trial chamber concerning his health. It also should be noted that Ms. Adoli Dulac, the civil party lawyer who has been recognized by the Bar Association of Cambodia already but has not yet been recognized by the trial chamber. And today, Pech Ong, the national lead co-lawyer for civil parties, is absent without reason. Thank you. President, thank you. And Madam International Lead Co-Lawyer for Civil Parties, anything you wish to say?
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. Good morning to you, to all of you here. Pech Ong is a bit late and he apologizes for this. If you would like him to introduce Elodie Dulac after the morning break, that's possible. I am not in a position to do that because I am an international lawyer. Thank you.
President, thank you. You may be seated. The floor is now given to the prosecution to continue their closing statement. You may proceed.
Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning, Your Honours. Good morning to the civil parties in the courtroom and outside. Good morning to parties in the courtroom. Good morning to the public in the gallery. And good morning to the public watching from outside. Your Honours, today, the final day of the prosecution's closing statement in this case, we will divide the day into 4 parts. First, we'll finalise our submission on demonstrating how power and authority was exercised through the CPK Party Centre before and during the Democratic Kampuchea period. Second, we'll demonstrate the roles of the accused in the CPK and the Democratic Kampuchea power structures and the true nature of their character then and now. And third, we'll demonstrate how the individual contributions of Nuon Chea and Khieu Samphan contributed to the criminal policies and the crimes that are charged in this indictment. And finally, we will request the sentence that Nuon Chea and Khieu Samphan should receive for their participation in the crimes in this trial. Mr. President, on Friday we finished towards the end of our submissions regarding the demonstration of how the CPK Party Centre exercised authority and control over the administrative zones in Democratic Kampuchea. We were halfway through showing how that authority and control over the zones could be seen in the revolutionary flag publications of the party, which provided instructions and guidance to party members on the implementation of the party lines and policies. We highlighted one example, and that was the August 1977 issue of the revolutionary flag. It was a published speech given by a party centre representative on the 25th of July 1977 at the West Zone Cadre Conference. Your Honours, we have referenced this speech a number of times during this trial because it tells us much about what happened during the Democratic Kampuchea period, why so many people were killed, and who was responsible. From this speech alone, we can see that party leaders were so obsessed with enemies that they believed 50% of the people in a zone were not good and 15 to 20% were traitors. So through this single speech, it can be seen that party leaders were giving constant instructions to attack and smash the enemy. And let us be clear, Mr. President, to state the obvious, we are not talking about wartime enemies arising out of clashes between the Vietnamese and Cambodian on the eastern borders. These so-called enemies were fellow Cambodians of Nuon Chea and Khieu Samphan, who they believed should be killed because they were from a certain class, ethnicity, or race, or nationality, or political persuasion, or because they worked with the former government. The party centre was attacking its own people who were not attacking them. Your Honours, it's clear beyond any reasonable doubt from the evidence the killings cannot be blamed on autonomous zone warlords acting contrary to the wishes and policies of the party centre. Zone and sector leaders certainly share in the responsibility of what took place between the 17th of April 1975 and 1979, but they were not acting autonomously. They were doing exactly what the party leaders wanted. They were carrying out the criminal plans and policies that had been decided and agreed to by all party centre leaders, by zone leaders, sector, military and leaders from the Democratic Kampuchea ministries. Your Honours, I'd now like to turn to an examination of the Standing Committee meetings to demonstrate the level of control and supervision that Standing Committee had over the policies in the zones. While only a small number of the minutes survive and were not destroyed by the Khmer Rouge leaders, they are able to show the authority of the party centre over all aspects of democratic Kampuchea. In paragraphs 191 and 192 of their written closing submissions, the Nuon Chea defence has sought to downplay the importance of the Standing Committee, asserting that it only dealt with issues at a very general, abstract or superficial level. Once again, the best way to debunk this misrepresentation of the defence is by looking at a few examples of the Standing Committee meeting minutes. Your Honours, the earliest surviving Standing Committee meeting minutes are the record of its trip to the Northwest Zone in August 1975. Now, I'll discuss this trip in a bit more detail later, but at this time, let me simply quote a few of the decisions made by the Standing Committee on the occasion that refute the defence's assertions. Your Honours, if you look at Section 2(1)(b) of these minutes, which are aptly entitled Certain Concrete Measures, the Standing Committee provided the following instruction on how to protect the border with Thailand. And I quote, "A mix of old and modern weapons should be used, including especially spikes to place along the border." Make a plan on how many spikes to be used in 1 month. All kinds of spikes must be used, those at the height of a person's foot sole, instep and shin, and up to the stomach." Unquote. Your Honours, for the defence to describe the Standing Committee as a body that only dealt with issues in the abstract or on a high level or a general basis is clearly a misrepresentation of the facts. On many occasions, the party centre leaders decided the fate of individuals. They made concrete decisions that resulted in the deaths of tens and hundreds and thousands of people. They were the big brother, prepared to oversee and dictate every small detail of people's lives in order to achieve their revolutionary goals. There are many more examples and evidence before you that prove this. If we look at the same minutes from August 1975, the Standing Committee provided the following instruction regarding the cities that a few months ago they had ordered evacuated and which now stood empty. And I quote, "Cities, they must be taken care of. Small wooden houses should be disassembled as requested, though there has to be some assigned forces to do the disassembling. It is requested that strategic crops such as coconut trees should be planted in the cities. In some places it's requested that banana trees should not be planted since they spoil the beauty." Unquote. Your Honours, as reflected in the 9th of October 1975 meeting minutes, it was the Standing Committee that decided where to build new military airfields and where to install radio and radar stations. These minutes also contain the following decision or instruction, and I quote, "One important line is infantry, so we must concentrate on production factories for weapons, ammunitions and mines. At the same time, we must have some tanks. Example, in Ratanakiri, there is only 1 gun per village. In 3 to 4 more years, let it be 100,000 to 200,000 people. As for guns, use 1 shot, 1 bullet." Unquote. Your Honours, if we go to the 22nd of February 1976 Standing Committee minutes on economic matters, which has an attendance list showing that both Nguyen Chia and Khieu Samphan were present, the very specific and real decisions that were made included increasing salt production from 50,000 to 60,000 tonnes and taking, quote, additional adolescent children from the base areas and handing them over to industry for management," unquote. The Standing Committee also decided at this meeting how to distribute Chinese aid rice it had received. And I quote, "Distribute a quantity of rice to Comrade Mut, 5,000 bags, to Ko Kong, 2,000 bags, Sector 25, 10,000 bags. As for the remaining amount, keep in reserve for use in Phnom Penh," unquote. If we now go to the 8th of March 1976 Standing Committee meeting, at which party leaders from Siem Reap, Preah Vihear and the Old North Zone reported on the enemy situation in their regions, the following instructions was provided as to how to proceed with certain suspected enemies in the North Zone. And I quote, "Question and keep them at one site and report to upper echelon along with the case file," unquote. Your Honours, at the same meeting, the party leaders made decisions regarding the amount of rice that would be taken by Angkar from these regions. and the use of water amongst various districts in Siem Reap sector, specifically referencing the 1977 goal to export for sale at least 100,000 tonnes of rice from that sector. Only 4 representatives of the party centre were present for the meeting: Pol Pot, Nguyen Chia, Khieu Samphan and Duan. Then 5 days later, Your Honours, at the meeting of the Standing Committee held on the evening of the 13th of March 1976 regarding the resignation of Sihanouk, participated in both Khieu Samphan and Nguyen Chia, the CPK leaders decided that they would let Sihanouk live, though he would not be allowed to leave the country. With regards to Sihanouk's children, however, the party leaders determined to try to lure them back into the country so they could be killed. And I quote, "Send a wire for his children to come immediately, explaining that they are coming for the New Year's and the independence celebrations. We want to resolve this problem cleanly. We must resolve it like this, to the benefit of the revolution," unquote. Your Honours, the minutes also note that because these decisions involved matters of major importance, the final decision on these issues would be left for the centre, meaning a collective decision of the entire Central Committee. Your Honours, another example of the social or cultural restructuring of Cambodian society that was engineered by the CPK leaders can be seen in the minutes of the 1st of June 1976. A meeting with representatives of the Ministry of Propaganda, at which Nguyen Chia instructed that certain words should be taken out of songs and played on the radio, including Bava, meaning most beautiful, Punaray, meaning colourful, and Sokamalapiep, meaning well-being, because these songs, I quote, sound like or similar to those from the previous regime. Pol Pot expressed his agreement with Nguyen Chia, proposing that another song be taken out because, I quote, parts of it copy the Sihanoukist decadence, and including the ministry to not allow, I quote, much of the old rhythms which cause negative impact on our party's influence, unquote. This, Your Honours, was the level or extent to which the party centre controlled life in democratic Kampuchea. In regards to the Standing Committee meetings, the minutes of the surviving records show that Khieu Samphan regularly attended the meetings, a fact he admitted when he was interviewed by the co-investigating judges. Of the 19 surviving Standing Committee meeting minutes, that contain a record of the attendees. Khieu Samphan was present for 16 of those meetings, an 84% attendance rate. In their final trial brief, paragraphs 259 to 277, the Khieu Samphan defence asked this chamber to conclude, based on this evidence, that their client only attended 4% of the Standing Committee meetings that were likely held over the entire course of the democratic Kampuchea period. In other words, Khieu Samphan asked this chamber to believe that by a remarkable twist of fate or fortunate coincidence, that of the 200 or 300 Standing Committee meetings whose minutes were destroyed, they were all the meetings that he did not attend. Your Honours, the inference or conclusion that they suggest is not a reasonable one and must be rejected. When Khieu Samphan acknowledged to the co-investigating judges that he attended standing committee meetings, he did not indicate that he only attended such meetings during a particular period of time. He testified to both the frequency of standing committee meetings and the various locations at which those meetings were held, without any qualification suggesting that his participation in and knowledge of such meetings was limited. Your Honours, the only reasonable conclusion from Khieu Samphan's testimony and the high percentage of meetings he attended in the surviving minutes, that's 16 of 19, is that Khieu Samphan was a regular attendee at standing committee meetings throughout the Democratic Kampuchea period. Your Honours, before I move on to the next section of our submission, where we'll discuss the character and the roles of the two accused, I would like to point out two other facts or pieces of evidence that show the party centre's control over the zones and refute the defence assertion of zone autonomy. First, Suan Kanil and other CPK cadres familiar with the Democratic Kampuchea communication structures testified that zones were not allowed to engage in direct communications with other zones, but instead had to direct such communications through the centre. Suan Kanil, who worked in the Central Zone Telegram Office, testified to this chamber, and I quote, "There was no telegram communication between zones unless there was permission from Office 870, unquote." This testimony, Your Honours, is corroborated by a number of surviving telegrams in which zone officers specifically request Office 870 to forward information on to other zones. The prohibition of the party centre of intra-zone communications further refutes the defence contention that zones were allowed to act with autonomy. And finally, Your Honours, you would remember the testimony from the Secretary of an autonomous sector who reported directly to the party leaders in Phnom Penh, Sector 105 Secretary Sao Sarun. He was a witness who provided first-hand evidence on the relationship between the party centre and regional organisations. Sao Sarun testified, for example, that authority from the party centre was required in order to release detainees in cases, and I quote, relating to politics or betraying the party, unquote, such as, I quote, persons collaborating with the aggressor Yuan or the enemy, unquote. Sao Sarun described being called to meetings in Phnom Penh with Pol Pot, Nguyen Chia, Khieu Samphan and Sun Sen, where he would report on the situation in his sector and received instructions from the party centre leaders. He also described how on one of the occasions that he and other sector leaders were called to a meeting in Phnom Penh, and a Sector 105 cadre in his group was immediately arrested upon their arrival at Pochentong Airport. Your Honours, these are the facts about the authority of Nguyen Chia and Khieu Samphan and the other members of the party centre, facts which prove their knowledge of and control over events in all zones and regions in democratic Kampuchea. Mr. President, I will now turn to the evidence of the roles that Nguyen Chia and Khieu Samphan played both before, during and after the crimes charged, and the character traits that they displayed over this period of time. We submit that it's the evidence of these roles and character traits which provides critical evidence in understanding, one, what their level of their contributions to the criminal policies and resulting crimes were, two, whether they intended those crimes to occur, and three, whether you should believe their defence in this trial as to their lack of participation in these crimes. I will start with an analysis of the evidence relating to Nguyen Chia. Who is Nguyen Chia? What did he and what does he represent? Throughout this trial, we heard Nguyen Chia's National Counsel ask witnesses whether he was a normal person who loved his country or a cruel and barbaric man who abused and tortured those around him. The question posed by Sanarun seems to us to be an unhelpful choice. In reality, humans are far more complex beings than this. We have many layers, and the face of a killer can sometimes be hard to see. Those that are responsible for death on a large scale rarely reveal their darkest sides in public. Killers are often people who come across to others as normal. And history has certainly taught us that political leaders may profess to love their country very much, but still be capable of horrific crimes. So, who is Nguyen Chia? When asked by Tet Sambat whether he was disturbed by the execution of his former comrades and friends, this is what Nguyen Chia had to say, and I quote, "The party decided to kill them because they were betraying the party and the nation. I was not scared or sad when they were killed. They had done wrong and betrayed us, so they received the kind of treatment they deserved. We were friends, but friendship and political work are separate." Unquote. Your Honours, Nguyen Chia expressed similar views and sentiments, admitting to and justifying the extrajudicial killings by the CPK of people they viewed as traitors in democratic Kampuchea in the following video interview, which I ask that be played.
Was it right to kill your comrade? I don't want to be accused of being brutal. But if we have to consider whether it was reasonable given the threat they pose to our nation, we can't just think of the individual. Think how threatened our country was. We have to look at the scale and magnitude of danger posed to the nation. It is so dangerous to the nation. It was not an everyday issue. It was not an issue of losing small inches of territory, but it was the risk of losing the entire nation. And we will never, ever be able to release ourselves. We have to think of our younger generation. What would they end up with? They were Cambodian, but right inside them, they were something else. So we had to look at that. If we had to show our mercy to these people, the nation would have been lost.
So, Your Honours, the answer to the question, who is Nguyen Chia, is that he's an extremist willing to illegally kill others to achieve his and the Communist Party of Kampuchea's vision. He was an extremist back in the 1970s when he was second in command, brother number 2 of the Communist Party of Kampuchea, and one of the leaders who ruled over democratic Kampuchea. Judging by his statements during this trial and the defence that has been put forward by his lawyers, he remains the same extremist today. A bitter man who sees foreign imperialists, the CIA, KGB and Vietnamese spies lurking around every corner. A man who, when asked about the lack of human rights in democratic Kampuchea, responded that the, I quote, highest human right, the most important human right, is the right to take up arms to fight an enemy, unquote. Dismissing rights such as free speech as merely, I quote, ordinary. A man willing to kill even his own relatives and revolutionary brothers who he had fought by his side for 15 years, if it was suspected that they were not 100% loyal to the party. An extremist to the core. Someone who, even in the eyes of Pol Pot, was, and I quote, too hardline, unquote. Your Honours, there are few graver threats to humanity than those posed by those that are so blinded by their ideology, beliefs or religion that they are willing to do anything, to employ any means, however destructive or unlawful, to achieve their goals. The ends justifies the means may be a part of Stalinism or Marxist-Leninist ideology, but it's certainly not a principle of law that can ever be accepted in a civilised society. For Nguyen Chia and the CPK leaders, however, the ends did justify the means. We see this in the party lines that were prepared by Nguyen Chia and Pol Pot and approved at the party congresses, policy that expressly authorised the use of illegal means and revolutionary violence as the primary means of the basic form of struggle. Your Honours, it was through their extremism that Nguyen Chia and the other CPK leaders crossed the line from left-wing nationalists fighting for their country to war criminals responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Cambodians. The CPK leaders admired Stalin and Mao and viewed them as role models for the communist revolution they would implement in Cambodia. However, in their minds, the failure or weakness of Stalin and Mao was they didn't go far enough. And so, beginning on the 17th of April 1975, the CPK emptied out the entire city of Phnom Penh and every other city and town in this country and turned Cambodia into a prison without walls, as has been described by my colleague, Ms. Jia Liang, in her submissions to you. Mr. President, Your Honours, to understand the accused Nguyen Chia and whether you can trust and believe the exculpatory assertions that he's made during the course of this trial, we ask that you keep in mind a revealing admission he made in private to Tet Sambat. Nguyen Chia finally began to open up to Tet Sambat after years of visits. He opened up to talk about his knowledge of and responsibility for arrests and executions during the Democratic Kampuchea regime. He also made it clear that he had no intention to be as open and forthcoming with this court. And this is what he said. I quote, "If they ask me in court who killed the people, I will say I was in charge of the legislative body and education. So the killing was the problem of government administration, which was the responsibility of Pol Pot and Sun Sen. If they still ask me, then I will tell them it started with Kissinger." Unquote. And, Your Honours, so it has been. At the initial appearance before this court on the 19th of September 2007, Nguyen Chia made the following assertion to the co-investigating judges, and I quote, "As for myself, after the liberation, I was in the legislative body, so I was not involved with the executive. Besides the party, there was a military committee of the party whose chairman was Pol Pot with Sun Sen and Ta Mok as deputies and Sao Pim and Kay Pok as members. So I was not in the military committee. I was Deputy Secretary of the party and President of the Assembly. Besides that, I was in charge of educating cadres and party members. So I was not involved in anything in relation to these charges." Unquote. Your Honours, he repeated the same lie a few hours later at his adversarial hearing, which can be heard on this video clip that I will now play.
The military committee had the duty to...
As I've already stated, power rested in the hands of the military division on which the country depended.
Your Honour, the full quote was hard to hear, but it states, "The military committee had the task of national defence and purging internal enemies. As for me, I was on the legislative side. I never made any law to kill my own nation." Unquote. And of course, Your Honours have seen Nguyen Chia repeatedly resort to this same lie throughout the trial. I had nothing to do with the military. I was not responsible for S21. I was busy with the legislature and education. Your Honours, we know this is a lie because there was no real legislative body in Democratic Kampuchea. The People's Representative Assembly that Nguyen Chia was the chairman of was a sham. During this trial, the Chamber heard from two of the CPK cadres who had been purportedly elected to the Assembly, Ung Ren and Prak Yut. Both of these witnesses testified that they only learned of their election after the fact, that they were never invited to any meetings of the Assembly, and that no legislation was ever debated or passed. Nguyen Chia himself has admitted that this fabricated defence is a lie, telling Tet Sambat that he never went to the National Assembly and that, I quote, "there was nothing to debate because we had no laws to pass." Unquote. The truth about the People's Representative Assembly is also shown by the minutes of the 8th of March 1976 Standing Committee, where Khieu Samphan made a presentation on the upcoming Assembly election, and he, Pol Pot and Nguyen Chia discussed how they would deceive the public on the matter. And if I can quote from those minutes, "If anyone asks, we must explain, not be wild and disorderly, do not let it be seen that we want to suppress. At the same time, do not speak playfully about the Assembly in front of the people to let them see that we are deceptive. And our Assembly is worthless. In fact, it still remains the task of the party," unquote. Your Honours, there is much evidence before you that proves the true role of Nguyen Chia in the CPK and the Democratic Kampuchea regime. Over the last 2 years, you've seen the evidence of Nguyen Chia's involvement in the military, the statements of Yang Sari, Doik and other witnesses that Nguyen Chia was a member of the party military committee. In the January 1977 speech, which he gave to the Revolutionary Army of Kampuchea on behalf of the military committee, the telegram sent to him by Division 164, and his communications with Sun Sen, and the minutes of the standing committee meetings that prove Nguyen Chia's general responsibility for military and security matters as the Deputy Secretary of the party. You have also seen the irrefutable evidence proving Nguyen Chia's responsibility for the S21 security office. The numerous confessions with handwritten annotations indicating that a copy was sent to Brother Nguyen. The testimony of Nguyen Chia's bodyguard and messenger, Saut Tong, that he picked up thick envelopes of documents at Doik's house and personally delivered those documents to Nguyen Chia. The detailed testimony of the chairman of S21, Doik, about his relationship and communications with Nguyen Chia. The recorded admission made by Nguyen Chia to Tet Samba that he received so many confessions he could not read them all, and his admission to Tet Samba that he did take over direct responsibility for S21 when Sun Sen was assigned to the East Zone military front. Your Honours, at our last document presentation on the 27th of June 2013, we took Your Honours document by document through this evidence of Nguyen Chia's role in S21 and the military, as well as the evidence that proves Nguyen Chia held the title of Acting Prime Minister for almost 1 year from September 1976 to 1977. That evidence is also cited and discussed in our final brief that we filed last month. Your Honours, for that reason, I will not go back through those documents again today, but instead I will use the remaining time on the subject of Nguyen Chia's general role and character to respond to a few of the assertions made by the Nguyen Chia defence in their written and closing submission. Your Honours, during this trial and in the early interviews and statements, we have frequently heard Nguyen Chia assert that he is not, and I quote, an intellectual. In paragraph 175 of Nguyen Chia's closing submission, his lawyers dispute that he was the chief ideologue of the CPK and argue that Nguyen Chia's intellectual limitations somehow prevented him from playing a major role in the formulation of CPK policies. This is perhaps the saddest and most desperate of lies. Nguyen Chia is a man who studied law at the most prestigious university in Thailand. He is a man who is fluent in at least 3 languages. He is a man who sat across the table from the top leaders of Vietnam and China by himself to negotiate agreements on issues of critical importance to the CPK. He is a man who admits studying communist literature, including the writings of Stalin and Mao, and preparing the original party statute and lines for the Cambodian Communist movement. The Nguyen Chia who testified in this trial was not an intellectual weakling. The man we saw was combative, strategic, evasive, calculating, and fully engaged at all times. It was clear from the first moment he took the witness box in this trial that while his body may be old, his mind remains strong. Your Honours, it also defies all logic and reason for Nguyen Chia to claim on the one hand that he was not an intellectual and therefore was unable to comprehend to formulate CPK policy, and yet at the very same time claimed that his principal role in the CPK was to educate the cadres on those policies. Perhaps Nguyen Chia or his lawyers can explain to us in their submissions how it's possible that you can educate cadres on policies if you don't understand them yourself. So when Nguyen Chia claims he's not an intellectual, these are not words of modesty. They are words of a criminal who is engaged in deception to minimise his responsibility for the criminal policies, plans and decisions of the CPK leadership. Nguyen Chia also disputes, in paragraph 174 of his closing submission, that he was ever known as Brother Number 2 during the DK period. He uses this to challenge the memories of key witnesses who testified against him and referred to him as Brother Number 2. Witnesses such as Doik, Ung Reng and Pipon. It is Nguyen Chia, however, who is mistaken or lying, and the memory of these witnesses are correct. This is proven by contemporary DK-era documents that contain references to Brother Number 2. For example, in the S21 confession of Chap Mit, a district secretary from the East Zone, there is a note on it that was written by Doik to interrogate upon, stating, and I quote, "Brother Number 2 has advised on the 25th of February 1978 that the names of certain cadre must be withdrawn if they appear in this confession," unquote. In the September 1976 report from Doik to Sun Sen and the notebooks of S21 cadres that refer to a proposed plot to kill Brother Number 1 and Brother Number 2. In the notebook of Chan Mam Nai, alias Chan, one of Doik's leading torturers at S21, his references Brother Number 1's speech and contain the following reference to Nguyen Chia, and I quote, "Our party always makes the example of socialist revolution. Brother Number 2 arrested his nephew named Sat," unquote. Your Honours, other numerous S21 confessions contain references to Brother Number 2, including the confessions of senior party leaders such as Vaughan Vet, Khoi Ton, Pang, Kang Chap, Chow Chet, Hugh Nim and Bo Pat, alias Hang. Your Honours, the deceit of Nguyen Chia on this issue is also once again shown by his published interviews with Tet Sambat. When Nguyen Chia described his relationship with Pol Pot, he stated, and I quote, "They just called him and me Brother Number 1 and 2, unquote. Mr. President, I'll conclude my discussion of the role and character of Nguyen Chia with 2 video clips that we believe show glimpses, at least, of the mind of Nguyen Chia and the criminal intent that lies within it. The first is from his recorded interviews with Tet Sambat.
If we keep those individuals, we would lose our country and people. We would lose Cambodia. And we would have no Cambodia today if we kept them. I have feelings for both the nation and the individual, but I clearly distinguish between them. If we must choose one or the other, I choose the nation. The individual I cast aside. They must be solved first. So, are you sorry for those who were killed? Answer: I have no remorse. I am more sorry for my country because it became messy. I am really regretful for the DK's stance.
And, Your Honours, in a further video of the interview with Nguyen Chia and BBC reporter Phil Rees, we see his scornful disrespect of the charges against him and the prospect of international justice, which I ask that it now be played.
Take very seriously his role in the death of well over 1 million people.
If they have evidence to convict me, then that's fine by me. That's justice. I'm now 76. How long can they imprison me? If they jail me for 20 years, then I'll be 96.
Mr. President, Your Honours, I will now move away from Nguyen Chia and his role to the role of Khieu Samphan, the role he played and the character traits he possessed both before, during and after the Democratic Kampuchea period, to understand what the level of his contribution to the criminal policies and resulting crimes were, and whether he intended those crimes to occur, and whether his defence in this case is believable. Let me begin with the same question that was posed for Nguyen Chia. Who is Khieu Samphan? Your Honours, Khieu Samphan has presented himself in this trial as a man who fell into the Communist Party of Kampuchea by accident, a man who rose to the highest echelon of the CPK but remained blissfully unaware of the atrocities that were planned and implemented by his colleagues. He will ask you to accept that, hidden away in the party headquarters, working and living with Pol Pot and Nguyen Chia, holding positions within the highest decision-making bodies of the party and government, he had absolutely no knowledge of or role in the mass murder and enslavement that these bodies were planning and coordinating. He will ask you to accept that he did not know what the party of which he was a leader was actually doing. To this day, Khieu Samphan seeks to present himself as a man of integrity, honesty and intellectual, a man who was different from the other leaders. He says those other leaders kept him in the dark. He says he did not ask questions because he respected the CPK rule of secrecy. And Pol Pot used him as a figurehead. Somehow, this unlucky pawn found himself at the pinnacle of a slave state, a member of the most secretive and powerful bodies of the CPK, surrounded by mass murder and yet completely unaware of what was happening around him. the only man in all of Cambodia who knew nothing, saw nothing, and heard nothing. Your Honours, the evidence we've put before you paints a very different picture. It paints the picture of a skillful and manipulative political leader, a member of the CPK's core leadership, an educated man who had a thirst for absolute power, a man who, together with Pol Pot and Nguyen Chia, approved the use of violence as a means to accomplish and enforce that power, a man who called for the execution of innocent people, a man who believed it was right to destroy all those who stood in the way of the CPK, a man who took part in the decisions to empty the cities, break up families, and enslave an entire population in the most inhumane conditions imaginable. This man embraced the role of a leader and the public face of the Khmer Rouge, both before, during, and even after the democratic Kampuchea period. He performed that role very effectively, using his public image to flaunt what he described as the great successes of his party, and to attract and gather legitimacy for the CPK, while ridiculing its critics. In 1975 and 1976, this man of integrity rejected reports of atrocities in Cambodia as slanderous campaigns and I quote, an irritating and meaningless noise, unquote. But today he stands before you and says, I knew nothing. Your Honours, as an integral part of the CPK Party Centre, Khieu Samphan took part in the conception, planning, organisation and oversight of the crimes with which he is charged. As I stated earlier, he was inseparable from Pol Pot, Nguyen Chia, Sun Sen and the other leaders in the party centre. Allow me to quote briefly from Khieu Samphan's statements, which describe the circumstances in which he worked and lived with those other leaders. First, in an interview he gave the France Culture radio station in August 2007, where he admitted how close he and Pol Pot really were. I quote, question, were you ever afraid of being purged, of becoming a victim of a purge? Khieu Samphan, never. First of all, because I value discipline, and second of all, because I was always living in close quarters with the Cambodian leaders. They could see me, and Pol Pot trusted me, I'm telling you, unquote. Second, I would like to play a recent video interview where he amplified this admission.
Pol Pot has his own method of working, and we all knew about him. As for me, when I was there, I hate nothing. We all knew clearly I spoke to him, but I respected him.
And Your Honours, in another admission from Khieu Samphan's 2004 book, which referred to earlier, I quote, in a word, Pol Pot represented the historical leader who was never wrong when it came to making important decisions. Judging from what I saw during the expanded sessions of the Permanent Bureau, however, nothing approaching fear was apparent during these meetings. Indeed, the meetings were informal. They were more like a family reunion. Members would often take time out to tell jokes, unquote. Your Honours, here you have the sense of Khieu Samphan's reality as a leader of the CPK, the real picture of Khieu Samphan and his family of CPK leaders. Sitting down for their reunions to work together and joke, while millions of victims were forcibly separated from their families. Against this evidence, the defence for Khieu Samphan argue that the most Khieu Samphan may be guilty of is naivety. They quote from his August 2001 open letter in which he says the following, and I quote, "To the compatriots who lost their loved ones during this period, I ask forgiveness. I ask them to excuse my naivety. I thought I was carrying out my duty for our nation's survival and prosperity. I did not imagine it would lead to such killing," unquote. Your Honours, we submit this is a desperate statement of a man seeking to hide his involvement in a massive joint criminal enterprise. Khieu Samphan was certainly not naive. In an interview conducted not long before he was brought to this court, he was asked if he felt cheated by Pol Pot. He said, and I quote, perhaps we have a video on this one, Your Honours, and I'd ask that to be played.
Do you feel cheated by Pol Pot? That he didn't let you know? No. Because afterwards, still, I felt that he was right. What Pol Pot really did had certain reasons behind it.
Your Honours, Khieu Samphan is no fool. As he says, he was not cheated by anyone. He was, in fact, very much involved in the crimes. He shared Pol Pot and Nguyen Chia's vision. That is why he was trusted. That is why he became and remained a leader for some 28 years. The evidence we put before you and analysed in detail in our written brief demonstrates that Khieu Samphan had held several key positions in the CPK and DK regime. He was a member of the party centre. He was the public face of the murderous regime. He was directly involved in the enslavement and forced labour program through his supervision of the Ministry of Commerce and state warehouses. He played a direct role in the establishment of Democratic Kampuchea and was its head of state. He oversaw Norodom Sihanouk's house arrest. He became a full rights member of the Central Committee. He was a member and chairman of the Political Office 870, an executive office responsible for overseeing the implementation of all party centre policies. He investigated senior members of the party who had become under suspicion. As I discussed earlier, the surviving set of minutes of the Standing Committee meetings show Khieu Samphan attending 84% of those meetings. Those minutes record plainly and unambiguously the leader's orchestration and monitoring of crimes, from purges of enemies to enslavement and the use of forced labour. I referred earlier to the minutes of the 8th of March 1976 meeting on base work, where sector secretaries reported to Pol Pot, Nguyen Chia and Khieu Samphan on the arrests they were carrying out. At that meeting, the leaders ordered these secretaries to send the files of suspected enemies for review. I'll now show you the first page of that document, which shows the attendees. You see in the first line the names of the top leaders: Pol Pot, Nguyen Chia and Khieu Samphan, Comrade Hem. One of the three secretaries reporting at this meeting was Comrade Hang. You can see his name on the lower right-hand side of this excerpt. Hang was in charge of the Priya Vihir sector, Sector 103. His full name was Bo Pat. He was a long-standing friend and protege of Khieu Samphan's. He worked for Khieu Samphan in the late 1950s at the Observateur magazine in Phnom Penh. Here he was reporting to the party centre, telling them, among other things, that his sector had arrested more than 100 people since January 1976 for fleeing into Priya Vihira from other sectors. In early 1978, Bo Pat was himself arrested and sent to S21, where he was executed. His confession has been placed on the case file. Another attendee at this meeting, whom Khieu Samphan knew very well, was Suavazi, alias Doan. His name is listed right after that of Khieu Samphan. Doan was a former Deputy Secretary of the North Zone. After April 1975, he became the head of Political Office 870, an executive arm of the party centre. The only other member of that office was Khieu Samphan. Doan lived in K3 together with Nguyen Chia and Khieu Samphan. They worked and ate together. They attended many standing committee meetings together. Your Honours, like Hang, Doan was arrested and killed at S21. As the evidence we have put before you demonstrates, Khieu Samphan took over Doan's role as chairman of Political Office 870. In fact, Your Honours, all of the attendees at the 8th of March 1976 meeting, except for Pol Pot, Nguyen Chia and Khieu Samphan, were killed at S21. All of these people are individuals who Khieu Samphan knew and worked with. They were loyal cadres, but they fell under suspicion and were put to death at the party centre's chief prison, S21. And yet before you, Khieu Samphan stands and makes the most incredulous claim of all, that he knew nothing. The truth is the exact opposite. Not only did he know of the arrests, he supported them. He took part in the development and implementation of the very criminal plan which led to these thousands of other deaths. Khieu Samphan's attitude to these crimes is recorded in numerous interviews and statements he's made over the years. In some, he believes the deaths were justified. As he said in a recent interview, and I quote, "Pol Pot did not just arrest cadres randomly. These were matters that had to be investigated, monitored and seen clearly," unquote. He told Stephen Hedder in 1980 that not a single one of those arrested and killed was innocent. The exchange is so compelling that I'll read it to you word for word. And I quote, this is Stephen Hedder. Question: "So what about people like Hu Yun and Hu Nim and all the others who were executed as a result of being accused of treason? Hu Yun and Hu Nim were friends of yours, and I guess you also knew many of the leading party cadre who were killed because they were accused of being CIA agents or KGB agents or Vietnamese agents. What about all those zone and sector secretaries and deputy secretaries and members and all those brigade secretaries and deputy secretaries and members? I find it very hard to believe that there were so many agents of imperialism and the Vietnamese within the party. I take it you believe they were all agents, that all of those who were executed at these levels were correctly accused and should have been killed. You don't think it is possible some of them were wrongly accused, that some of them were loyal communists and patriots and wrongly killed? As far as you know, there weren't any cases where somebody innocent was accused? End of question. Khieu Samphan answers no. Question: not a single one? No, none. Question: so everybody who was executed was in fact a traitor? Answer: yes, as far as I can grasp. Unquote. Your Honours, everything with Khieu Samphan is utterly uncompromising. For him, every person whom the CPK targeted died because they deserved to die. And there can be no doubt as to the authenticity of the admission he gave to Mr. Stephen Hedder. In his testimony, Mr. Hedder described the interview and he said, I quote, "I have a pretty clear memory of this conversation because of the kind of combative and confrontational, emotional nature of it. It's something that I remember," unquote. Your Honours, in the same interview, emphasising that all of the arrests and executions were justified, Khieu Samphan admitted his own involvement. And I quote, "There was a comrade in the West. He was accused by the UN agents. They were responsible for that. They accused him. However, they were not successful because we investigated the case in a timely manner," unquote. You'll also recall Khieu Samphan's 1987 publication in which he compared the death toll under the Democratic Kampuchea regime as being less than the numbers of deaths in car accidents in other countries. Your Honours, we submit these statements are highly relevant. They expose him. They unearth who he really is. They are a reliable path to his mind, arrogant, unrepentant and unapologetic. These statements show the man's direct involvement in the joint criminal enterprise and his utter disregard for human life. If we can listen to Khieu Samphan's words again on this video clip.
You should say to yourself that without Pol Pot and without the Khmer Rouge, and as of the years that followed the 1970 coup d'etat, Cambodia would have been in the hands of the Vietnamese communists. Don't forget that. Please don't forget that. And what does this mean? What does it mean to fall in the hands of the Vietnamese? What does it mean to us Cambodians? What is this going to mean in the future? This must mean that it wouldn't have taken long for Cambodia in its entirety to become a part of Lower Cambodia in Vietnam. And how many millions of Cambodians are living in South Vietnam today? Do you know how the Cambodians are living in the south of Vietnam today? The millions of Cambodians in Kampuchea Krom today? I'm telling you. It is a gigantic S-21 over there. Isn't that so? So, compared to this little S-21 over here, you want people to forget the enormous S-21 over there in Cochin, China?
Your Honours, to Khieu Samphan, S-21 is a little matter. Little because the vast suffering wrought upon the people of this country was irrelevant. In the same interview, when asked about the children who were killed at S-21, he declared, and I quote, "A few youngsters is not a reason to erase and reject an entire period of history," unquote. Your Honours, and the same attitude seems to have affected Khieu Samphan's defence. At paragraph 146 of their written brief, the defence discussed Khieu Samphan's February 1975 order for the execution of senior officials of the Khmer Republic, arguing that the order related to, and I quote, merely 7 people. If I can give Your Honours another example of Khieu Samphan's view that extrajudicial murder is justified. In a recent interview, he discussed in detail how Chan Chak Ray, an East Zone commander who was sent to S-21 in 1976 after being accused of complicity in an explosion near K3, the workplace and residence of Nuon Chea and Khieu Samphan. In his 2007 book, Khieu Samphan makes abundantly clear his support for the arrest of Chakri and other CPK cadres. And I quote, "The evidence Philip Short provided about the Vietnamese having created the Khmer Rum Do movement, together with the evidence that other researchers have discovered, makes it clear that all of Pol Pot's monitoring, following his 378 principle of Chakri, Chuk and Ya and the other cadres who had cooperated with the Viet Minh, was correct. Thus, Philip Short was incorrect when he wrote, quote, the role of Prison S-21 and the confessions was not primarily to provide information, but rather to provide the proof of treason that they needed to arrest anyone they had already decided to arrest," unquote. Your Honours, in other words, Khieu Samphan believed then, and still believes, that the regime's prison in which suspected enemies were tortured and executed performed a valuable investigative function. When asked about the statement that I've just quoted, expert Philip Short described it as, and I quote, "the classic Khmer Rouge CPK explanation," unquote. Your Honour, together with his colleagues Pol Pot, Nuon Chea, Yang Sari and Sun Sen, Khieu Samphan devised, organised and oversaw mass murder, the forced evacuation of the cities and the turning of this country into a nation of slaves. What explains Khieu Samphan's involvement in these crimes? The answer is he believed that the crimes were necessary, that they were absolutely justified. And why were they justified? Because facing a false choice between allowing his people to live in freedom and defending his party, Khieu Samphan decided to sacrifice the people. If we look at his words in a 2006 interview, and I quote, "Stop talking only about the killings, which is only one side of the coin. If you want your country to gain independence and freedom, you have to dedicate something for your nation. People may not have so much freedom. Political leaders have to practice radical policy," unquote. These words summarise neatly Khieu Samphan's attitude throughout the period that the CPK ruled Cambodia. The supposed imperative of building the country at breakneck speed and defending the party against imagined enemies, justifying the emptying of the cities, the murdering of potential opponents, and the enslavement of the entire nation. In his written brief, Khieu Samphan attempts to downplay a key contribution he made to CPK's slave state, the creation of democratic Kampuchea. He describes himself as having been heavily confined to a heavily guarded compound in an empty city. He says he merely followed discussions on the new constitution and elections for the new Parliamentary Assembly. He says he simply inherited a role which Norodom Sihanouk refused because it was devoid of power. Your Honours, let's compare the fate of these two men. One, Norodom Sihanouk, refused to have any role in the CPK's slave state. The other, Khieu Samphan, helped implement a charade designed to give the CPK an appearance of democratic legitimacy, and then accepted the highest formal office in the land, President of the State Presidium. He then used that office to prop up the regime and issue numerous public endorsements of the CPK's criminal policies in 1976, 1977 and 1978. Khieu Samphan was in fact directly and actively involved in the creation of the state of Democratic Kampuchea. The evidence before Your Honours shows that he issued a detailed report on the draft constitution of the new state on the 14th of December 1975. In that report, he declared that the power to make laws was vested in an elected parliament. In fact, as I've indicated before, the parliament was an utter charade. As a member of the party centre, Khieu Samphan knew this. He attended the standing committee meeting at which the assembly was described as worthless. Khieu Samphan also coordinated the sham elections for this pretend parliament, as demonstrated by his report at the 8th of March 1976 standing committee meeting. At this stage, Norodom Sihanouk submitted his resignation to Khieu Samphan, refusing to participate in CPK's slave state and leaving himself at the mercy of the party centre. This was an act of courage of a man who did not want to be associated with, in any way, with CPK's murderous program. Sihanouk was placed under house arrest. Khieu Samphan, on the other hand, remained an active CPK member, leader, that he had been for many years. Your Honours, if we look at how Pol Pot discussed Norodom Sihanouk's fate at a secret meeting attended by Nguyen Chia and Khieu Samphan on the 13th of March 1976, and I quote, "In fact, Sihanouk is a tame tiger with only skin and bones, no claws, no fangs, and his whiskers have been pulled out as well. Therefore, he is just waiting for the day of his death. We keep him as a dignitary. We do not kill him, but for the nation and the people, he bears serious guilt in his status of a killer of the people. We will maintain him, but if he keeps on struggling to free himself, we must end it. We must end feudalism just like this. The chess game has gotten to that point. The entire feudalist regime has been permanently smashed and dug out by the revolution. The kings existing over 2,000 years must, in the end, be clean." Unquote. Your Honours, here you have Khieu Samphan, as well as Nguyen Chia, attending a meeting at which they are contemplating murdering the former king. Note these words, Your Honours, they are important, and I quote again, "We do not kill him, but if keeps on struggling to free himself, we must end it." Unquote. These are the words of the regime which Khieu Samphan wholeheartedly embraced, the regime he agreed to lead and the regime he agreed to represent. For the next 3 years, this man who professes before you that he is a man of peace and a man of integrity personally oversaw Norodom Sihanouk's house arrest. Khieu Samphan continued to perform his role as a senior leader of the CPK and DK until the dying days of the regime. You will recall the evidence given by several witnesses placing him at a meeting in January 1979, issuing instructions to military commanders and heads of ministries before he fled to reunite with Pol Pot and Nguyen Chia. Even after 1979, as the people of this country came to terms with the horrific extent of the Khmer Rouge atrocities, Khieu Samphan fought for their return to power. He did so for almost 20 years before surrendering in 1998. Mr. President, that finishes the section on the role and the character of the accused, and I would now move on to the contribution of the crimes, but I see that it's 10:30 and it may be an appropriate time to break.
The President. Thank you, Mr. William Smith. The time is now appropriate for the morning break, and the chamber shall break for 15 minutes, and we resume at 10:45.
សូមអញ្ជើញក្រោកឈរ